If you walk down West 52nd Street in Manhattan today, you are surrounded by the towering steel of corporate America. It is loud, it is busy, and it is thoroughly modern. But if you know exactly where to look, and if you know the history of the pavement beneath your feet, you realize you are standing on the ruins of the wildest era in American history. We are talking about the height of Prohibition. And when most people think of Prohibition, Speaker One, they think of grim basements. They think of bathtub gin that might make you go blind, sawdust on the floor, and a nervous guy at the door looking through a sliding peephole. It was usually a gritty, dirty business. Exactly, that is the stereotype. But there was another side to the dry decade. There was a level of illegal drinking that wasn't just about getting away with it. It was about doing it better than the law ever allowed. Today, we are talking about the absolute apex of that ambition. We are talking about a speakeasy that wasn't a basement dive. It was a mansion. This isn't just a figure of speech. We are looking at a literal mansion, renovated with what would be millions of dollars in today's money, specifically designed to hide a criminal enterprise in plain sight. It was an architectural marvel. It had disappearing walls. It had secret wine cellars hidden behind 2-ton brick doors that could be moved with a single finger. It had a guest list that included the mayor of New York, Hollywood royalty, and the most powerful mobsters on the East Coast, all sitting in the same room. And the most incredible part, it was never caught. Not really. The police raided it, the feds raided it, but the building itself was a machine designed to deceive. This is the story of the 21 Club, the mansion that hid a kingdom. To understand how a place like this gets built, we have to look at the men holding the blueprints. We are talking about cousins Jack Creedler and Charlie Burns. Now, these weren't your typical rough-and-tumble gangsters. They were sophisticated. They understood something fundamental about New York society. They understood that if you make something expensive enough and exclusive enough, people won't care if it's illegal. In fact, the illegality becomes part of the luxury. Before they got to the mansion on 52nd Street, they ran a few smaller joints in Greenwich Village, places like the Redhead and the Punch-In Club. Right, and the Punch-In Club is where they really refined their philosophy. They realized they didn't want the guys looking for a cheap beer. They wanted the Vanderbilts, they wanted the Astors. But to keep that clientele, you couldn't just have a bouncer. You needed an impenetrable fortress that felt like a country club. And by 1929, the noose was tightening. The feds were getting smarter. The small clubs were getting busted left and right. Jack and Charlie knew they had to move uptown, and they had to go big. They found a location at 21 West 52nd Street. It was a brownstone, a classic wealthy family home. Most bootleggers would have just rented the basement and paid off the landlord. Jack and Charlie bought the building. And not just the building, they eventually took over the property next door, too. This was their vision, a double brownstone complex disguised as a high society residence. The construction budget was astronomical for the time. We are seeing estimates that, adjusted for inflation, go well into the millions. They weren't just decorating, they were engineering. They hired Frank Buchanan to design the security systems. And Buchanan is a key name here. He wasn't an interior decorator. He was an architect with a mind for puzzles. He understood that a raid is a race against time. From the moment the police hammer on the front door to the moment they reach the bar, you have maybe 2 minutes. Buchanan designed the house to transform in those 2 minutes. The neighbors must have wondered what was going on. The amount of earth being moved, the steel beams going in. They were digging deep into the Manhattan bedrock. This wasn't just a renovation, it was an excavation. They were building a labyrinth beneath the city streets.
It was a massive risk. You have to remember, this is 1929. The stock market is crashing. The world is entering the Great Depression. And here are these two cousins pouring a fortune into a building that the government could seize at any moment. If they were caught, they wouldn't just lose the liquor. They'd lose the real estate. They'd lose everything. So let's walk through the finished product. Let's say you are a federal agent in 1930. You suspect there is liquor at 21 West 52nd Street. You kicked on the front door. What happens? The first thing that happens is a warning system is triggered. There was a complex system of buzzers and lights. The doorman sees you, he hits a button. Immediately, deep inside the mansion, the transformation begins. The bar itself was a mechanical masterpiece. I love this detail. The shelves behind the bar, which were stacked with expensive whiskey and gin, were hinged. If the alarm sounded, the bartender pulled a lever. The shelves didn't just hide, they tipped backward. The bottles would slide off the shelves, fall down a chute, and smash into the basement below. Think about that. By the time you, the agent, walk into the barroom, there are no bottles. The shelves are empty or reset. The bartender is wiping down the counter, but the agents aren't stupid. They know the liquor is somewhere. They start tearing the place apart. They look for the cellar. And this is where the genius of the secret cellar comes in. This is the crown jewel of the operation. Jack and Charlie knew that if they kept the liquor in their own basement, it would be found. So they did something incredibly illegal and incredibly clever. They broke through the foundation wall into the basement of the building next door, number 19. They didn't own number 19 at the time. They essentially tunneled into a neighbor's property to store the contraband. But you still need a door to get there. A wooden door sounds hollow. A metal door looks suspicious. So Buchanan designed a door made of brick and concrete. It weighed 2.5 tons. A 2.5-ton door? That sounds like a bank vault. How do you open that during a dinner service? That's the magic. It was so perfectly balanced on ball bearings that you could move it with a gentle push if you knew the trick. To the naked eye, it was just a brick wall in the basement. It had shelves of canned goods in front of it, old hams hanging from the ceiling. It looked like a pantry, but there was a tiny hole, right? A microscopic hole in the mortar? Yes. You had to take a long, thin metal rod, basically a meat skewer, and insert it into this specific crack in the bricks. That rod would push a catch inside the mechanism, releasing the lock. The entire wall would swing inward. Behind it lay thousands of cases of the world's finest wines and spirits. There is a famous story about a raid that lasted for hours. The agents were furious. They knew the booze was there. They could probably smell it from the smashed bottles in the chute, but they couldn't find the stash. They were standing right next to the meat locker. They were topping on the walls. But because the door was solid brick and concrete, it didn't sound hollow. It sounded like the foundation of the house. And while the agents are sweating in the basement, upstairs the party continues. This wasn't just about hiding liquor. It was about protecting the guests. We have to talk about who was drinking there. It wasn't just gangsters like Dutch Schultz. No, it was Ernest Hemingway. It was Humphrey Bogart. It was the mayor of New York, Jimmy Walker. Imagine the irony. The man responsible for upholding the law in the city had his own private booth in an illegal speakeasy.
The presence of the mayor was the ultimate insurance policy, but even he couldn't stop the feds. That's why the architecture was so vital. There were even secret chutes for the tablecloths. If a raid happened during dinner, the staff could strip the tables of liquor glasses, dump them down a chute, and replace them with coffee cups and dessert plates in seconds. It was theatrical. It was a performance art. The mansion wasn't just a building, it was a stage set. And the audience, the police, never figured out the plot. There was one specific raid, June of 1932. The agents tore the paneling off the walls upstairs. They smashed the furniture. But they never found the wine cellar. They left empty-handed. That wine cellar became legendary. It contained private collections for the most powerful people in America. Joan Crawford had a section, Richard Nixon later on, Elizabeth Taylor. They all stored their private stock behind that 2-ton brick door because it was the safest place in New York City. And we can't forget the culture they built. This wasn't a place where you stared at your drink. It was a place to see and be seen. The 21 brand became a symbol of surviving the Depression with style. While the rest of the country was standing in breadlines, the people inside that mansion were eating gourmet burgers and drinking vintage Bordeaux. But all things must pass, and the dry era finally came to an end. In December 1933, Prohibition was repealed. For most speakeasies, this was actually bad news. They thrived on the thrill of the illicit. When you take away the secret knock, you're just another bar. That's true. Many of the famous speakeasies vanished overnight because they couldn't compete as legitimate businesses. They didn't have the culinary skills or the service standards. But Jack and Charlie had built a mansion, not a dive. They were ready. On the day of repeal, a massive truck pulled up to 21 West 52nd Street. It was delivering the first shipment of legal liquor. Jack Kreindler signed for it openly. They transitioned from the country's most sophisticated criminal operation to the country's most sophisticated restaurant without missing a beat. And they kept the secret door. They didn't tear it down. It became a museum piece within the restaurant. The very mechanism that had thwarted the FBI became a tour attraction for their VIP guests. If you were important enough, the maitre d' would take you downstairs, hand you the metal skewer, and let you open the wall. The mansion solidified itself as an institution. It became the boardroom of American power. Deals were made at Table 21 that changed the course of industry and politics, and it all rested on that foundation of secrecy and luxury established in the 1920s. Today, the 21 Club building still stands on 52nd Street. The restaurant has faced its own modern challenges and closures, but the history is physically embedded in the walls. The jockeys are still on the balcony, the iron gate is still there. And deep down in the earth, that 2.5-ton door is still there. It is a monument to a time when a bootlegger needed the skills of an engineer, the budget of a tycoon, and the nerve of a gambler. It remains the ultimate secret of New York's Gilded Age. Imagine walking down 52nd Street in Manhattan in 1929. The air is thick with the smell of roasted nuts from street vendors and the exhaust of Model T Fords. To your left and right are beautiful brownstones, the homes of the old money elite. It looks quiet, respectable, boring even. But if you stop in front of number 21, and if you know the right name to drop, the iron gates open. You aren't walking into a home. You are walking into a fortress of luxury that is technically a crime scene. It's hard to reconcile those two images. A crime scene that looks like a palace. Usually when we talk about speakeasies, we're talking about basements with sawdust on the floor and bathtub gin that might make you go blind.
Exactly. That is the popular image of Prohibition, the gritty, dark, dangerous underworld. But there was another side to the dry years. The side where a bootlegger wasn't just a thug in a pinstripe suit, but a curator of high society. We are talking about an operation that cost, in today's money, millions of dollars to construct. A place so sophisticated that the mayor of New York City had his own table, while federal agents were scratching their heads on the sidewalk outside. So this wasn't just about hiding a few bottles of whiskey. This was about hiding an entire lifestyle. Precisely. Today, we are opening the doors to the most luxurious, most ingeniously designed, and most enduring speakeasy in American history. A place that didn't just survive Prohibition, it became a legitimate institution that still stands today. This is the story of the mansion that hid a $2 million secret. I'm stuck on that number. $2 million in the 1920s? Well, the operation itself generated that kind of revenue, and the renovation costs were astronomical. You have to understand the sheer audacity of the owners, Jock and Charlie. They weren't just running a bar, they were engineering a marvel. They bought a brownstone mansion in Midtown Manhattan, an area that was rapidly becoming the center of the jazz world, and they decided to gut it. But they couldn't just hire a regular contractor and file permits with the city saying, "Hello, we would like to build a secret dungeon for illegal liquor." Right, the paper trail alone would have sent them to prison before they poured the first drink. So how do you build a massive architectural wonder in total secrecy? You hire people who know how to keep their mouths shut, and you pay them double. The vision for this place, which would eventually become known as the 21 Club, was simple. It had to be unbreakable. Jock and Charlie had been raided before at their previous locations. They were tired of losing inventory. They were tired of the hustle. They decided that if they were going to do this, they were going to build a place that the feds could tear apart and still find absolutely nothing. That sounds like a challenge. If the feds know you're selling liquor and they come in with oxes, surely they're going to find something. You would think so. But Jock and Charlie hired an architect and engineer named Frank Buchanan. Now, Buchanan wasn't designing skyscrapers. He was designing illusions. The brilliance of the 21 Club wasn't just the decor, which was opulent. We're talking silver service, fine linens, mahogany paneling. It was the mechanical engineering hidden behind the walls. Mechanical engineering for a bar? Absolutely. Let's start with the front door. To even get inside, you had to pass a series of inspections. There was the iron gate where a doorman, usually a man named Jimmy who had a photographic memory for faces, would check you. If he didn't know you or if he didn't look the part, you weren't getting in. But let's say you get past Jimmy. You enter the foyer. It looks like a wealthy family's entryway, but the entire building was wired with a silent alarm system, like a panic button, more sophisticated. Every strategic point in the mansion, the entryway, the hallway, the bar itself, had a hidden button. If a doorman saw a suspicious car pull up or recognized a Prohibition agent, he pressed the button. Instantly, a light would flash in the barroom upstairs. But it wasn't a loud siren that would panic the guests. It was a subtle signal to the bartenders. So the bartender sees the light. What happens then? Do they just run out the back? Running implies guilt. No, they made the evidence disappear. This is where the engineering gets incredible.
The shelves behind the bar, the ones holding the expensive scotch, the gin, the rum, were not actually shelves. They were balanced on a mechanical pivot system known as a dumping mechanism. A dumping mechanism. That sounds heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking if you loved whiskey, but it was life-saving if you hated prison. When the alarm was triggered, the bartender would pull a hidden lever. The shelves would instantly tilt backward. The bottles would slide off the shelves and fall into a chute hidden inside the wall. The chute was lined with angled metal baffles. Baffles. To break them?
Exactly. The bottles would smash against the metal as they fell, shattering the glass. The liquid in the glass would plummet all the way down to the basement, directly into the city's sewer system through a specialized drain. Within seconds, literally seconds, the bar shelves were empty. By the time the agents broke down the heavy oak doors and ran upstairs, the bartender was standing there, wiping down a clean counter. And the room smelled faintly of alcohol, but there wasn't a drop to be found. That is genius. But wait, the smell. Wouldn't the smell of 50 smashed bottles of scotch give them away? It might raise suspicion, but suspicion isn't evidence. You can't arrest someone for a smell. The agents needed physical bottles. They needed liquid they could test. And it was all gone, washed into the East River. But that was just the bar inventory. That was the daily use supply. The real treasure, the $2 million worth of vintage wines and high-end spirits, was hidden somewhere else. The stockpile. You can't dump thousands of bottles down a chute every time someone knocks on the door. No, you can't. And that brings us to the most famous secret of the mansion, the wine cellar. Now, this mansion shared a basement wall with the building next door, number 19. Jack and Charlie actually bought the building next door just to control that wall. They excavated a secret cellar underneath the neighboring building, but the entrance was inside number 21. Okay, so a secret door, like a bookcase? Much heavier. A bookcase is a cliché. This was a marvel of masonry. It looked like a solid brick wall. It felt like a solid brick wall. If you tapped on it, it sounded solid. But it was actually a massive door made of brick and concrete weighing 2.5 tons. 2.5 tons? How do you open a 2.5-ton door? With a meat skewer. A meat skewer? It sounds like a joke, but it's true. The door was so perfectly balanced on ball bearings that despite its weight, it could be moved with a gentle push if you released the lock. But the lock was invisible. There was no keyhole. To unlock it, you had to take a long, thin piece of wire, roughly the length of a meat skewer, and insert it into a tiny, almost invisible crack in the mortar between two specific bricks. You had to hit the exact spot to trip the electromagnetic lock. That is straight out of a spy novel. Actually, it's better than a spy novel. It really is. Once you trip that lock, this massive section of the wall would swing open silently. Inside, they stored thousands of cases of the finest wine in the world. We're talking about vintages that were illegal to import, illegal to own, and worth a fortune. When the agents came, and they did come repeatedly, they would storm the basement, they would tap on the walls, they would measure the dimensions of the room. But because the secret cellar was technically under the neighbor's house, the measurements of the mansion's basement added up perfectly. They never found the void. So the agents are standing inches away from the stash, staring at a brick wall, having no idea that a fortune is sitting right behind their noses. For years, they raided the place constantly. They knew it was there. It drove them insane. There's a famous story of a raid that lasted for hours. The agents were tearing the place apart. Meanwhile, the customers, who were the wealthiest people in New York, were just sitting at their tables, finishing their meals. The staff had cleared the liquor, so technically everyone was just having a nice dinner. The agents left empty-handed, and as soon as the front door closed behind them, the brick wall swung open, the bottles came back up, and the party continued. Let's talk about those customers. Who are we seeing in this room? If I'm sitting there in 1930, who is at the table next to me? You are seeing the absolute pinnacle of American celebrity and power. At one table, you might see Ernest Hemingway arguing about literature or bullfighting. At another, Humphrey Bogart. You'd see the grand dames of New York society, the Vanderbilts and the Astors, wearing their pearls and sipping illegal champagne. But the most ironic guest, the one that really highlights the hypocrisy of the era, was Jimmy Walker.
The mayor of New York, the mayor himself. Jimmy Walker was a regular. He had his own booth. Imagine the scene. The man responsible for upholding the law in the largest city in America is sitting in an illegal speakeasy, drinking smuggled whiskey, surrounded by mobsters and movie stars. And when the raids happened, the police often gave him a heads up. He'd slip out a side door or, in some cases, just sit there and charm the agents. It was an open secret. It sounds like the 21 Club was more than a bar. It was a neutral ground, a demilitarized zone where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. That's a great way to put it. It was a club in the truest sense. Membership wasn't written down, but it was enforced.
If you were boring or rude or cheap, you didn't get back in. Jack and Charlie cultivated an atmosphere of exclusivity. They even had a hierarchy of seating. There was a specific section of the dining room that was considered the place to be seen. If the maitre d' tried to seat you in the back, you knew you had fallen out of favor. It was high school politics, but with millionaires. And dangerous millionaires, sometimes. Very dangerous. While the 21 Club tried to keep the rougher element out, you couldn't run a speakeasy in New York without intersecting with the mob. The liquor had to come from somewhere. But Jack and Charlie managed to keep the violence out of the dining room. They were diplomats. They balanced the demands of the gangsters, the police, and the politicians. It was a high-wire act that lasted for 13 years. 13 years. That's a long time to keep a secret. But Prohibition eventually ended. 1933 rolls around. Alcohol becomes legal again. What happens to a place that was built entirely around the thrill of being illegal? That is usually the death knell for speakeasies. Once the thrill is gone, the customers go back to hotels and restaurants. But the 21 Club was different. Because they had invested so much in the food, the service, and the atmosphere, they transitioned seamlessly into a legitimate restaurant. In fact, they became even more famous. The secret aspect became part of the lore. They kept the secret door. They kept the chutes. But now, instead of hiding the wine, they showed it off. So the secret cellar became a tourist attraction? For the VIPs, yes. If you were really special, presidential level special, you might get a tour of the cellar. Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, they all dined there. There is a tradition that started later where famous patrons would be given their own private wine storage in the cellar. Even today, if you go down there, you can see plaques on the wall marking the private stashes of Elizabeth Taylor, JFK, and Aristotle Onassis. That's incredible. The history is literally written on the walls. It is. And the architecture we talked about, it's still there. The building, the mansion at 21 West 52nd Street still stands. The famous jockey statues on the balcony are still there. And deep in the basement, that 2.5-ton brick door still works. You can still push it open with a wire. It's a time capsule. It's amazing that in a city like New York, where everything is constantly being torn down and rebuilt, this little pocket of 1929 survives. It survived because it was built to survive. Jack and Charlie didn't build a temporary hideout. They built a legacy. But I want to go back to the engineering for a moment because there's another layer to the protection that people often overlook. It wasn't just about hiding the liquor. It was about hiding the people. Hiding the people? You mean escape routes? Exactly. If a raid was particularly aggressive, if the agents weren't just looking for bottles but looking to arrest patrons, there needed to be a way out. The mansion was riddled with secret passageways. There was a door in the ladies' restroom that didn't lead to a stall, but to a staircase that went up to the private apartments next door. There were exits through the kitchen that led into the alleyways of 53rd Street. It was a labyrinth. It sounds like the Winchester Mystery House, but for drinking.
In a way, yes. And this complexity created a sense of adventure. Going to the 21 Club wasn't just dinner. It was theater. You felt like you were part of a secret society. And that feeling is what kept people coming back long after alcohol was legal. They weren't paying for the gin anymore. They were paying for the memory of the risk. I'm curious about the staff, the bartenders, the waiters. To operate a place like this, you need a staff that is incredibly loyal. You can't have a waiter tipping off the police. Loyalty was the currency of the realm. The staff at the 21 Club were paid exceptionally well, far above the standard wages. But it was more than money. Jack and Charlie treated them like family. If a waiter was sick, they paid for the doctor. If they got into trouble, the owners hired the lawyers. In exchange, they got absolute silence. There are stories of staff members who worked there for 40 or 50 years. They took the secrets of the patrons to their graves. And imagine the secrets they heard. Oh, absolutely. Business deals, affairs, political scandals. If those walls could talk, the government would probably collapse. The walls couldn't talk, but the table assignments did. I mentioned the hierarchy earlier. There was a section called the bar room, which was the prime real estate. If you were seated there, you had made it. But within that room, there were specific tables. Table 1, for instance. That was the power table. For years, the seating chart of the 21 Club was a more accurate map of American power than the Congressional Register. It's fascinating how a criminal enterprise evolved into the ultimate status symbol. It legitimized the illegitimate. That is the story of many great American fortunes, isn't it? But with the 21 Club, it was done with such style. Let's talk about the toy ceiling. If you look at photos of the bar area, the ceiling is covered in hanging toys. Model trucks, airplanes, sports memorabilia. I've seen pictures of that. It looks chaotic.
What's the story there? It started in the 1930s. A regular patron who owned a trucking company brought in a model of one of his trucks and gave it to the bartender. They hung it up. Then another patron who owned an airline saw it and said, "Hey, I want my plane up there." It became a competition. The captains of industry, the people building the skyscrapers, the airlines, the shipping fleets, they all wanted their brand hanging from the ceiling of the 21 Club. It became a suspended museum of American capitalism, and it all started in a room that was designed to break the law. So you have the secret brick door in the basement representing the hidden underground, and the toy ceiling upstairs representing the public flaunting of wealth. The duality is perfect. It is. And sadly, as we look at the mansion today, the story has a bittersweet chapter. The 21 Club operated for nearly a century, but in 2020, during the pandemic, it closed its doors. The future of the building is uncertain. The artifacts are being archived, the wine is being moved, but the structure, the bones of the Speakeasy, remain. That brick door is still there. The brick door is still there. The chutes inside the walls are still there. You can't erase that history. Even if it becomes a retail store or a private office, the ghost of the Jazz Age is baked into the mortar. I wonder if the new owners will even know. Imagine buying a building and realizing 5 years later that there's a secret room behind your basement wall. Well, the secret is out now, but I'm sure there are nooks and crannies in that mansion that haven't been discovered. Remember, Buchanan, the architect, was a master of concealment. Who knows if there's a safe that was never found, or a document stash hidden under a floorboard? The allure of the hidden Speakeasy is that we always want to believe there's one more secret. One more bottle of 1920 vintage waiting to be uncorked.
Exactly. But let's go back to the raid. I want to dissect the buzzer system a bit more, because it wasn't just a simple doorbell. It was a complex electrical grid. The doormen had triggers in the floor they could step on. This meant they could keep their hands visible, showing the agents they weren't reaching for a weapon, while simultaneously triggering the alarm with their foot. That is incredible attention to detail. They really thought through the psychology of the raid. The agents are looking at hands, not feet. Right. And inside the bar, the mechanism that dropped the bottles was also designed with redundancy. If the main lever jammed, there were secondary release points. They tested this system. They ran drills. Jack and Charlie would pretend to be agents. They would storm in, and the staff would have to clear the bar in under 60 seconds. If they failed, they practiced again. It was military precision. It's funny to think of bartenders running drills like soldiers. All right, everyone, wipe down the counters. Go, go, go. But that discipline saved them. Other speakeasies got lazy. They would pay off the local cops and assume they were safe. But the 21 Club knew that the local cops weren't the real threat. It was the feds. The Volstead Act enforcers from Washington who couldn't be bribed as easily. That's why the physical engineering was so important. You can't bribe a federal agent who is looking at a bottle of whiskey, but you can fool him if the bottle isn't there. Did they ever have a close call, a time when the mechanism jammed? There was one legend of a bottle that didn't break. It fell down the chute but landed on a pile of broken glass and survived intact. An agent reportedly found a shard of glass with a label on it in the sewer trap days later. But again, a shard with a label in a public sewer, it wasn't enough to convict. The defense lawyers, and they had the best lawyers money could buy, argued that anyone could have thrown a bottle down a sewer grate on the street. Plausible deniability was the shield. So they controlled the space, they controlled the staff, they controlled the narrative. It really was a fortress wrapped in velvet. And we have to talk about the kitchen. You can't have a luxury mansion without world-class food. During Prohibition, many speakeasies served terrible food because the focus was the drink. But the 21 Club hired French chefs. They introduced dishes that became staples of American fine dining. They created the 21 Burger, which was one of the first gourmet burgers, served without a bun originally, smothered in butter and herbs. They knew that if the alcohol flow was ever cut off, the food had to be good enough to keep people seated. Smart. Diversify the business model. If the bar is a crime, make the kitchen a destination. And it worked. When the raids happened and the liquor vanished, the guests would just loudly compliment the chef on the veal. "What liquor, officer? We're just enjoying this lovely cut of meat." It became a game. The patrons were in on it. They were co-conspirators. And that bond between the establishment and the customer is something you just don't see anymore.
It's a shared secret. There's nothing more powerful for building a community than a shared secret. And that community included the press. This is the other piece of the puzzle. Why wasn't it exposed in the papers? The journalists drank there too. Walter Winchell, the most famous gossip columnist of the age, was a regular. He knew everything. He saw the secret door. He saw the mayor, but he never printed it. He would write about who was seen at Jack and Charlie's, but he would never reveal the mechanics of the operation. He protected the house because the house protected him. The code of silence extended to the media. That is truly a different era. So, as we look back at this $2 million operation, we see that the money wasn't just spent on bricks and mortar. It was spent on building a network of silence, of loyalty, and of mutual benefit. The architecture, the secret door, the chutes, was just the physical manifestation of that network. The door is impressive, but the handshake was stronger.
Beautifully said. The handshake was the real lock. The brick door was just the backup. As we wrap up our tour of this hidden mansion, imagine standing in that basement today. The air is cool. It smells of dust and old wine. You run your hand over the rough brick. You find the tiny crack. You insert the wire, and with a low rumble, the wall moves. For a split second, you aren't in 2024 anymore. You're in 1929. The jazz is playing upstairs. The smoke is thick, and you are part of the most exclusive club in history. I can almost hear the glasses clinking. The speakeasy that became a mansion, a monument to the time when America outlawed fun, and a few clever men decided to build a palace to protect it. Thanks for joining us on this tour of the underground. Keep looking for those secret doors. You never know what you might find behind a brick wall.